Welcome back, Sebastian here. So last week, I believe, last week or the week before, I made a video talking about F1 silly season going into the 2024 F1 season. Of course, that was before the big bombshell dropped last week about Lewis Hamilton and his move to Ferrari in 2025. So now things have changed dramatically since then, and that video is basically obsolete at this point. But I decided, let's make a video looking at talking about the 2025 Mercedes seat that Lewis Hamilton will be vacating, and who are some of the candidates to replace him at Mercedes. So I've kind of put a bunch of names on the board. I think I've got eight names total. Pretty good chance that the driver who replaces Hamilton is one of these guys on the board. I'd honestly be shocked if it wasn't. And I kind of ranked them in some kind of order. But we'll start at the top. Fernando Alonso, of course, driving with Aston Martin this season. I think he would be a really interesting option. Of course, last year showed that he's still performing at a very high level, and I think could be a really nice mix with George Russell, younger driver with a very experienced driver. Of course, the one caveat with Alonso is that he is getting up there in age, and he would only be there for 1 or 2 years, which honestly for Mercedes may be perfect, given who they have coming up in the pipeline. The other thing I want to mention with Alonso is that, of course, he was involved in Spygate all those years ago in 2007, which contributed to Mercedes basically paying a 500 million euro, I believe euro or pound fine to the FIA for basically McLaren staff. I believe 1 or 2 people involved with McLaren basically spying on Ferrari and getting access to technical documents from the team. And of course, Alonso had a big role in that, and you could go into a whole video just talking about that. But Alonso, of course, had a role in that, so there's been, the talk for years that Mercedes, or at least Mercedes corporate, would never allow Alonso to race for them again. But, we'll see. Watch this space. All right, next we have two more drivers who I think are also pretty good candidates for the seat. One is Alex Albon of Williams. Although, of course, there's rumors that he does indeed have a contract for 2025 that may need to be bought out if a team wanted his services. But for Albon, I think he would be an interesting option. Of course, a younger driver, they could have him there for many years if they wanted to. For Albon, though, I think there's a couple caveats there. The last time he was at a top team, the Red Bull seat 2019-2020, wasn't particularly great. Up against Max Verstappen, and so I think that's definitely going to be a red flag there. That being said, I do know that the 2020 Red Bull car was incredibly difficult to drive, very oversteery, and Albon just never was able to kind of get to grips with it. Last 2 seasons as well, his teammates have been Nicholas Latifi and Logan Sargent, which are definitely not the highest benchmarks in F1. So I think it will give them pause. It's a bit of a risk given that 1, he had a pretty bad experience at Red Bull, and 2, his 2 most recent teammates have not been particularly good, so it's kind of hard to gauge how good of a driver he's developed into. Next we have Carlos Sainz, of course, the guy who's being replaced at Ferrari. And I think Sainz could be a really good option for Mercedes. He's not youngish, I think he's 29 this year. But he's also really experienced and still has many years left in F1, and assuming many still towards the peak of his career, the peak of his peak performance. He's a very smart driver. He's a guy who's moved, unfortunately for him, has moved around a lot recently. 3 years at Ferrari, 2 years at McLaren, 1.5 years at Renault, and then of course the 2.5 years at Toro Rosso. So he's never been in a team for more than 3 years. Of course, this will be his 4th year with Ferrari. But for Sainz, I think he could be a really good fit. And I think similar to Albon, he's a guy who could be there for quite a long time. That being said, I do have some questions with both Albon and Sainz. If that's going to be a championship winning lineup. If you put Russell with Albon, Russell with Sainz together, is that a championship winning lineup? Could in theory ask the same question with Alonso. But at this point, Mercedes are kind of coming from a position of weakness, given that Hamilton is the one who kind of walked away from the team. Then we have some other options I think are definitely less plausible than the top 3. I think the top 3 are actually probably the best options. and then the ones below that, I think there's a lot of question marks involved. So next we go on to Daniel Ricciardo. I think if this was 2018, 2019, 2020 even, I think Mercedes would have picked Ricciardo right away. Unfortunately for him, I think his time is kind of come and gone to have a chance at a Mercedes seat. The last half season that we had, 2023, was okay, but still very small sample size. And I think there's still a lot of questions about what driver we kind of have with Ricciardo right now. And I think there's also going to be questions about his adaptability, given how poorly things went at McLaren. But I'm not exactly sure what his contract status is. I think he's technically up at the end of 2024, but at the same time, he may have a general kind of Red Bull contract, which doesn't allow him to which kind of forces him to stay within the Red Bull ecosystem. I think a lot will hinge on how he performs this year, and if Red Bull decide for whatever reason not to bring him back to the team. Then we get to Alpine, and I think both of their drivers could be candidates for the Mercedes seat depending on how their seasons go. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Ocon. Of course, Ocon is formerly a Mercedes young driver. There was pretty significant rumors of him joining the team in about 2019 when he was dropped from Force India, but those never came to be. And I think for Ocon as well as Gasly, I think they're interesting options. If either of them have a really strong year, they could definitely put themselves in the position to be able to try to get that Mercedes seat. But I think at this point, there's quite a few drivers in front of them for that seat. Same thing with with Gasly. Interesting driver, but same kind of caveats as Albon. He already was in a top team, and it didn't go particularly well against Verstappen. Whereas for Ocon, he's never really had a top seat in F1, so would be interesting to see him there. Then we get to the, I would say, absolute wild cards. We have for Haas, Nico Hülkenberg, and of course Mick Schumacher, who of course isn't really a Haas driver, but his last team was Haas. For Hülkenberg, similar situation to Ricciardo, really a matter of poor timing, I guess. I think at this point he's probably a bit too old to be on Mercedes' radar, and he hasn't really shown the performance that Alonso has, which I think kind of allows Alonso to still be in contention for this kind of thing. But for Hülkenberg, the last year was pretty impressive. And of course, German driver might help with the marketing. Same thing you could say for Schumacher. But I think for Hülkenberg, unfortunately, his time's kind of come and gone. I don't really think he's really a serious contender for the seat. Same thing with Mick Schumacher. I know, despite Toto Wolff saying repeatedly the last couple of years that Schumacher deserves a seat in F1, I highly doubt they would put Mick Schumacher in the seat. He's probably thinking more along the lines of a seat at Williams. Then before I get to the last option, I'm going to talk about the one over here. So we have Bottas, of course, drove for Mercedes for a long time between 2017 and 2021. A lot of experience with that team, and I think if he was doing, a better performing to a higher level than he is right now at Sauber, then I think he would be a serious contender for that seat. I think they would consider taking him on, but I think all being considered, he hasn't really set the world on fire at Sauber, hasn't just absolutely destroyed Giro the last couple of years, although the first year was definitely beat him pretty heavily. But last year, it was pretty close between the two of them. And I think in those bottom four teams, he was outperformed by Albon in pretty comparable machinery. So I do think for Bottas, unfortunately for him, his time at Mercedes has come and gone. Now, last guy on the board, Andrea Kimi Antonelli. If you haven't heard of him, you'll hear about him now. So for Antonelli, he drove in Formula Regional European Championship run by Alpine, which known as FRECA, last year 2023, and this year he's skipping Formula 3 and making the jump up to Formula 2. So he's I believe 17 years old, and that's a lot of pressure to put on a guy who hasn't even raced in F2 yet. That being said, he is a Mercedes young driver. He has an excellent junior record. I wouldn't say quite Verstappen level, but at this point in time, very, very similar to guys like Piastri, Leclerc, Russell, those kinds of drivers. So it'll be really interesting to see how things go. But that being said, I don't think there's any shot that Mercedes puts him in the team for 2025, except in a very small situation which I'll describe later. But for Antonelli, I think a lot of pressure on him already, despite the fact that he hasn't even turned a wheel in F2 yet. So that's definitely something to watch. Now, for Mercedes, they have two options. They can try to sign a driver now, before the season started, or they can basically wait until summer break, like teams usually do. I think there's risk involved with both. I think if Mercedes went and tried to sign a driver now, we know that the Mercedes is a works team, and for 2026 that's going to be really valuable. So even if they don't have the best performance at the start of the season, it's still a really valuable seat. And they finished second in the constructors last year, and while it's not the Mercedes of old from the early turbo hybrid era, it's still a really highly coveted seat. So I think at this point in time they could easily attract a driver like Alonso, Albon, Sainz. Even any of these guys would give anything if Mercedes came calling. But I think the real interesting question is, what happens if Mercedes have an absolutely awful start to the year? What does Lewis Hamilton know that has led him to sign for Mercedes for 2025? And I think, if Mercedes come out with an absolute dog of a car, 5th, 6th, 7th in the Constructors' Championship, a driver like Alonso, a driver like Sainz may not want to sign there. It may limit their options. It may mean that they have to take a guy that they probably didn't want to take, or Gasly and Ocon, Bottas even. And in that situation where, they're really struggling at the start of 2025, don't have a ton of great options, and Antonelli's lighting the world on fire in F2, they may take a risk and sign him for 2025. I think in a situation where Mercedes will have a really terrible 2024, and they're kind of like, they can afford, I think, so if Mercedes have a terrible start to 2024, I think they could afford to take the risk to hire Antonelli for 2025. I think it would be, two very low probability events happening: Mercedes having a terrible year, and Antonelli having an absolute fantastic year, which I think honestly is not too far-fetched, but still on the lower end of probabilities, I would say. So I think that means that all things considered, from what we know now, I think of the drivers available, I think Mercedes are probably going to be looking at either Alonso or Sainz. I think those are two best options. But like I said, it really depends on what they want to do. If they really want to prepare for Antonelli coming into F1, I think Alonso would honestly be the perfect stopgap. And I say performance-wise, probably a little bit better than Sainz last year. But it's hard to tell given that Alonso's teammate was Stroll. But still, I think Alonso would be a really good choice. I think it would be really interesting to see Russell and Alonso in the same seat together. So that's all kind of for my discussion for Mercedes 2025 seat, and knowing how things went down last week. I expect Mercedes will announce a driver tomorrow, and this video will be all for nothing. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. I think my YouTube stats were telling me that over 50% of my viewers haven't subscribed, so it'd be nice to get a few more subscribers before the year gets going, and kind of help that push that algorithm along. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.